Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise and Folly podcast. I'm joined by Swithun Dobson and Keith Preston to discuss the origins of identity politics in the cult of the veterans. So, I think what's important to point out is today in the United States, while almost everybody is supposed to defend the troops, there was there was an excerpt from I think it was Manufacturing Consent where Noam Chomsky was talking about how sloganeering is meaningless, and support the troops was the slogan that he chose because it was something that everybody, if you're a good, decent American, you have to support the troops. And, if throughout much of early American history, that wasn't the case at all. In fact, the idea that these are our wars rather than the wars of a particular president, I think really begins with World War II, because people who opposed, say, the War of 1812 called it Mr. Madison's War. People who opposed World War I called it Mr. Wilson's War. So this idea that we were the same as the president and then it was our war and these are our troops wasn't necessarily how Americans used to see things. They used to be more partisan in that regard and say, well, I don't support that president's decision to go to war. Now, once the war was engaged in, then, people were expected to get in line, but that was easier said than done. But now it's different, right? Across the political spectrum, everybody sort of has to support the troops, at least if you want to be, in polite society. And I think this is really the origination of identity politics, because if we look at identity politics and see it as, any sort of political movement where you identify with a lifestyle, a sexual preference, a race, or whatever is your political identity, there's certain things that they all have in common. So, for example, they tend to be very flamboyant. They'll dress a certain way. So, for example, to just compare and contrast, on the one hand, veterans, they always wear, caps that say I was in the Navy, or I was in the Marines, or I was in the Army. Or it'll say service, from these years to these years. And they have all sorts of paraphernalia. Much the same way that a homosexual has, if they want to play that up. They have this flamboyancy. They dress a certain way that tells you who they are. And so we can also then say this flamboyant attitude. And they want you to affirm their experience. That's one of the things that veterans always do. Veterans are going to ask for veterans discounts whenever they go buy things or sell things. And they're going to tell you they're a veteran, and they're going to want you to affirm their experience. I mean, it's almost like you meeting a homosexual on the street. They're going to tell you they're homosexual. They're going to want you to affirm all their experiences. And if you don't, then they'll get mad. And so all of the structural archetypes that exist in identity politics, I think, first exist in the cult of the veterans. And really, I think the cult of the veterans is developed firstly after World War II, but then more consistently after Vietnam, where the Army tried to cure Vietnam syndrome by having a lot of positive public PR for the Army, which is why, according to, to Pew, of all the U.S. government institutions, the Armed Forces is still the most highly regarded. And so, while it's definitely going to rub, I think, both sides the wrong way, I think that's where identity politics begins. And I also remember back in the George W. Bush presidency, Democrats would say, oh, well, because, they would complain that if they didn't support the troops, that they were shamed as bad people. And those sort of like shaming tactics that we'll see now used against more conservative people if they don't support that piece of woke agenda. One could argue that the people who voted for George W. Bush sort of pioneered those tactics by shaming dissenters, both right and left, of the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan. And so I think we'll hand it over to you, Keith. What are some of your thoughts on how the armed forces sort of began identity politics?
Well, I think you have to look at the concept of identity politics in multiple contexts, because people have always had identity politics of some type. I mean, and certainly in older traditional societies, people would identify very strongly with some kind of collective in the sense of a tribe or a clan or a religion or perhaps where they were from or something like that. In fact, older societies were far more collectivist than modern societies are in terms of not being individualistic in the sense of, the individual has no identity apart from their group. So identity politics in that sense is not anything new. In fact, you could argue it's actually a more traditional or conventional way of doing things than this idea of the individual that you have in more modern societies. But it is interesting, though, that the form that identity politics takes in modern societies isn't necessarily based on traditional identities, which would be things like family, maybe ethnic group or tribe, maybe religion. Instead, you have just about anything can be considered a form of identity. If we look at groups that are prominently labeled as having an identity politics, well, there are some that are based solely on skin color. They're just a very narrow reductionist characteristic like that, or sexual orientation, or gender, or there are others, and I think certainly veterans could fall into that as well. Now, there are veterans. Veteran identity politics isn't necessarily thought of as being part of the left, the cultural left, in the same way that the categories I just mentioned. But you do have this idea that an individual has this unique or special identity for having been a veteran. And I think you're right when you point out that that's something that's relatively new in modern societies as well. In older societies, not just in America, but in older societies, war was often thought of as, well, that's just two groups of kings fighting each other, or that's just two different aristocratic realms fighting each other. Or that's two papal armies or what clerical armies fighting each other. War wasn't personified on the basis of the individual citizen in quite the way that it is now. Nowadays we hear about our troops. Support our boys was a big thing at one point. That was a common denominator. So I do think it's true that modern societies have blended this idea of the military identity with the citizen identity, of the common person's identity. But I think that's rooted in the kind of politics of mass democracy that has emerged in modernity. If you look at, for example, the French Revolution, they were one of the first modern states to introduce mass conscription. The idea, well, we don't have these royal, feudal, dynastic armies of mercenaries. No, we have the people's army. Actually, I guess it goes back further than that. I guess you could say Cromwell's New Model Army, in some ways, sort of set the ball rolling for this. But then with the French Revolution, they amped it up even further. And it was also during that time that they were breaking down these other kinds of traditional identities. Like, one of the things they did in France was they wanted to do away with the regional provincial identities, and they wanted to do away with the various dialects of French and have a unitary national French language. And that was something that you saw throughout the 19th and 20th century, as these waves of nationalism and liberalism and all of these kinds of things emerged, where you saw a breakdown of more traditional ways of life, and then the development of mass democracy and mass society and all these other kinds of things. These new forms of identity went along with that, along with mass armies. You start to see the era of total war, where an entire society is mobilized for war, not just the soldiers, but, the American Civil War was sort of a prototype for that. Certainly World War I, World War II were the epitome of that. And I think it's out of that cultural milieu that you do get this idea of the soldier as this personification of the national identity or something like that. Now, leftist identity politics tends to, at least initially, it took on a kind of oppositional tone. Well, we're against the existing society, or we're against the existing set of social hierarchies, or whatever. But you do find a kind of reverential approach to identity when it comes to veterans that you find, say, among officially oppressed groups on the left. Only this is something that's more society wide. One thing I would add as well is that One thing that's interesting about a lot of people on the right in the United States is that, on one hand, they deify military service and veterans and support the troops and all of these kinds of things. At the same time, they will often espouse a type of social conservatism, and would say, well, we're against self-destructive lifestyles. We're against substance abuse and alcoholism and sexual deviancy or criminal behavior. Yeah, but somehow war is not a self-destructive lifestyle. Like going into the military and going to war is somehow not a something that's self-destructive to self and others and to the social fabric and all of that. So that is something of a really unique and interesting contradiction in some of their thinking.
Yeah, Swithun, your thoughts?
As you were starting, I was thinking along the same lines as Keith was, as to the sort of importance of the national army. It's certainly true. I mean, as the trajectory points out, that really since in England, probably from the Tudor period, the other sort of intermediary institutions, the church, civil society, etc., have become squeezed out of their historical prominence. The family as well has basically become an accumulation of individuals under the state. And so it isn't surprising that once all there exists is sort of the individual and the state, that the way to sort of bring the society together ideologically is via the army, in a way, which would then sort of bring cohesion to the society. So in that sense, it isn't surprising that they're held up in such a way. Although what is interesting, though, is in England, that isn't really the same case. I mean, the veterans, we don't know who they are. I mean, they just go around as normal people. So there is, I do wonder to what extent it's a peculiar American phenomenon, sort of the identity politics with respect to the armed forces. I would add an extra element as well, which follows on with Keith's point about the French Revolution of having the People's Army. I think the troops are particularly ideologically important, more so than they were historically following the sort of First and Second World Wars, insofar as they were both somewhat ideological wars, at least from the Americans' perspective, making the world safe for democracy, etc. And that kind of ideological aspect of both the First and Second World Wars provides the underpinning for the international order after 1945. And so, in a way, although you point to Vietnam as the major sort of PR job by the military to sort of hide some losses that took place in Vietnam, in a sense, I don't think it's surprising that they are held up in such a way, because they're a sort of living embodiment of the legitimizing, well, especially the older ones at least, legitimizing ideology of sort of like the Pax Americana, as it were. So that is, I think, interesting. Although, as I say, in England, that isn't really the case. And in England, the first sort of new identity politics was really race. Although it would be race and sort of the rise of feminism. As to what I would point to first is not obvious as to whether or not they fit sort of the classic sort of identity politics type stuff. Although, just with identity politics in general and in the UK, the UK Army now have adverts which says snowflakes, your army needs you on them, and are trying to sort of promote themselves to effectively a new group of people, because a lot of the white working class males are significant, well, not as great in number as they traditionally were. So that could well be branching out. But it certainly seems that identity politics, as it were, is more coming into the army more clearly in other ways, not as the veterans as such. But yeah, the US Army is going woke in the same way the CIA adverts are. So those would be sort of my opening thoughts.
Yeah, when you mentioned, Keith, in previous discussions that America is becoming more and more like the United States is becoming more and more like Latin America. And you mentioned just now, Swithun, that the U.S. military is one of the few actually functioning institutions in the country. And because everything is deracinated and broken up. And it reminded me of a comment by Carlos Rangel, a Venezuelan politician, diplomat, and analyst of U.S. Latin American relations. And the reason why so many Latin American countries was defaulted to military dictatorships was because the military was the only institution that actually existed in any form at all that could wield power in those countries. There were no other intact institutions. And that seems to be one of the things we've been talking about recently. But as far as your other comment, Keith, about war being self-destructive, I mean, in America, war wasn't really popular up until after Vietnam, because you had all these anti-war songs like Johnny We Hardly Knew You, and they would all throughout, draft dodging was big in the Civil War. It was big in World War I. It was big in Vietnam. World War II was a special case where everybody more or less, because it was perceived that we were attacked, and that's why it was a little different in how the people fell in line. But really, it's this post-Vietnam attempt to give a facelift to the Army, which has been, in the armed forces in general, which has been very successful. And then, Keith, you sent me before the stream a video where a guy was talking about how the CIA and the armed forces have always been, quote, woke, in the sense that, at least since 1945, since they were desegregating, integrating, doing all of these things that at the time would have been outside the Overton window of polite society. And so it's almost like once this particular group that wants to be normalized, or the government wants normalized, has had a presence in the military, they then get, the veteran status, which then allows the other members of that group to then become pulled into the mainstream. It's the same way that, television and movies help normalize homosexual relationships, because people saw them on TV, not realizing that's not real, that's just TV, but it broke down the inhibitions people had against it. And the armed forces does the same thing. And it's really always been doing that since the end of World War II. Because from, I think it was the end of the Civil War until the end of World War II, they didn't really allow non-whites to serve. They were very intentionally trying to recruit mostly whites. I mean, yeah, there were the divisions in the Civil War, and there were some in World War II, but that wasn't really the policy. It was homogeneous, and now the armed forces is more diverse. And I think one of the reasons why they do that is going back to a statement. I forget who said it, but it was a plantation owner somewhere in Jamaica during the 18th century. And he said that when he imported slaves, he wanted slaves from all over Africa, from different tribes, so that they wouldn't trust each other, they wouldn't be able to talk to each other, they wouldn't be able to organize with each other, and then he could keep them all divided underneath his thumb. And I think that's why they want the armed forces to be diverse in the same way, because it's not like, they're all the same people from the same town, from the same family, from the same village, whatever, and they can work together outside of your own authority structure. Whereas if it's increasingly diverse, you have that same benefit of top-down control. It solidifies top-down control in a way that a homogeneous workforce wouldn't. And I think that's in part why identity politics has been pushed, and what we might call proto-identity politics again, desegregation in the army and all that thing was being pushed was so that they could disintegrate these institutions and these cultural norms and these ethnic groups so that they could have an easier time controlling them. Because without necessarily going into the whole old left versus new left debate about ID politics, as Jason Unruh said, Malice Rebel News, identity politics has nothing to do with socialism. This is a distraction from pretty much everything. And yeah, so I think I'll hand that off to you, Keith.
There are a number of commentators from the progressive side of the spectrum that will point out that the military has actually been in the forefront of advancing social liberalism at times. The military, I think, as you pointed out, was the first institution in the United States to formally desegregate. Gays were able to be in the military long before they were able to get married or anything like that. And in fact, in many past situations that you can find commentary from progressives during times of wars, like World War I, for example, where they're saying that the war is a great thing because it provides an opportunity for a collective expansion of society and the creation of more collectivist institutions. Also, during the First World War, you had some black civil rights leaders that encouraged blacks to actually join the army because saying, well, we need to prove ourselves, that way we can be accepted by American society if we go fight for our country. So there's plenty of examples historically of the military being seen as a tool of social progress, or whatever you want to call it, liberalism or something like that. It's a misnomer that it's a misconception that the military is inherently something that's conservative. It may be conservative in certain ways in the sense of emphasizing internal discipline and things like that. But the idea that the military represents a type of social or cultural conservatism is but something of a misconception. Even back in the 1950s, which is today many people think of that as being a time in which conservatism or social conservatism was dominant, and it was by today's standards. But even back then, you had the CIA creating organizations like the Congress of Cultural Freedom. And what this basically was an effort by the CIA to create a liberal left that was essentially controlled opposition. That's really the best way to describe it. The CIA created this front group called the Congress of Cultural Freedom, recruited a lot of prominent intellectuals, backed a lot of progressive sounding projects or institutions, everything from art to social justice or whatever. They brought people who were very prominent progressive intellectuals like Bertrand Russell into their circles. Even I think some of the luminaries of the Frankfurt School may have been associated with this. But what this was a type of controlled opposition, a type of left that was controlled by the CIA directly, literally. What I see happening now is interesting because during the time of the Vietnam War, that made things like patriotism and military service and all of that unfashionable or unpopular. I know I had a professor when I was in college. He was a retired colonel from the Army, and he used to work at the Pentagon. And he was conservative, certainly when it came to military values or whatever. But he was saying in the years after the Vietnam War that you would see TV commercials for Army recruitment where they were saying things like, today's Army wants to join you. And of course, in the 80s, during the Reagan era, they tried to reverse and did, as you pointed out, they successfully reversed that in many ways. And they sort of restored this, kind of deification of, traditional military values and that kind of thing. And I think that is in part how the whole support the troops thing, the tie the yellow ribbon around the tree and all that kind of stuff developed. But I also think it's true that there are certain social groups and demographic groups in the United States where military service is more common. And I think it does feed that among those cultural and and tendencies and political tendencies that they're associated with as well. But now it seems to be going in an opposite direction. Now, increasingly, we're seeing the intelligence services, the military, and all of that brag about their liberalism, about their wokeness and enlightenment and inclusiveness. We see this series of ads that came out from the CIA recently. It was called "Humans of the CIA," which is a really weird title. I mean, it's almost like they're describing zoological specimens or something, but it's you have this one video. It's this Latino woman who's the daughter of immigrants, and she's talking about how she has generalized anxiety disorder, and she has she's talking about cisgenders and patriarchy. I mean, she sounds like some gender studies professor at Princeton or something. And then there's another video where there's this guy that's openly gay, very openly gay. He's saying, yeah, I came from a very conservative small town where they didn't really like gay people much, but now at the CIA, I'm accepted, I'm included. And you also had Lloyd Austin, who's now the Secretary of Defense. And he came out recently and said, well, LGBTQIA, whatever issues are going to be primary in our military. This is one of our primary Pentagon values now. And I think that what they're doing is, I think there's a purge going on to somewhat in institutions where I think at this point, they want to purge people that do have more conservative values, in the sense that they view that as now anachronistic. It doesn't fit in with the new woke rainbow, multicultural, self-legitimating ideology. And increasingly, I think the elites feel like having people in the military or in the intelligence services who are, what they might call red tribe loyalists or whatever, they look at it like they don't want those people because they don't think they're trustworthy. They might be inclined to storm the Capitol or something. It's no different than, let's say, I like to compare American politics, at least the cultural politics, to Iraq quite a bit as well, because in Iraq, it's the same way. It's getting to, Iraq is a society that is so fragmented and polarized that Sunni vote for Sunni, Shia vote for Shia, Kurds vote for Kurds, and everybody votes with their tribe or clan or sect, no matter what. It doesn't matter who the individuals are. It doesn't matter what their policies are. You just vote for your tribe because that's what you do. And of course, in, say, the Iraqi government, if you've got a dominant Shia coalition as the ruling party or collection of parties, of course, they don't want the Sunni to have too much influence in the military and state security services and that kind of thing. So I think that's what's going on now. I think now that the blue tribe, at the moment at least, is hegemonic, they control the presidency, they control the Congress, they control most of the elite institutions, or really all of them. I think now they're trying to purge the state security forces of red tribe loyalists because they don't see them as reliable. In fact, I think that's going to happen with the police as well. I think one of the long-term effects of the anti-police movement, we talked about this on a previous program, is that they will probably do a pullback of policing in like inner city, poor inner city, mostly black neighborhoods. But the effect of that is going to create higher crime rates. We're already seeing evidence of that. So then that's going to lead for more calls for law and order and including from minorities and civil rights groups and all of that. But then that's going to be used as a pretext for nationalizing the police. They'll say, okay, yeah, we got to fight crime, but we're not going to do it with these local police departments that are full of racist redneck cops. We're going to do it with a specially trained national police force where everybody's been inculcated with cultural competence and sensitivity training and all this kind of stuff. So I could very easily see and expect to see something like that emerging in the past. And I think the military is the same way. I think increasingly we're going to see the military being promoted as an institution that's really sort of like a nation unto itself. It's like a rainbow nation where, we're not black, white, gay, straight, male, female. We're all soldiers in the U.S. Army. And I think that's, the state sees that as beneficial to its own interests, where members of the military have no loyalty to anything other than their own tribe as soldiers. because then their loyalty is going to be to those who butter their toast, which is the power elite.
Yeah, Swithin, what are some of your thoughts?
I think Keith's exactly right when it comes to the loyalty aspect. And I think this is the reason why they're going to have these sorts of purges, because if you had a large army which was loyal to the ethnic group or some other idea or concept separate to the army in of itself, it might not follow orders. I think you might have increasing purges. I don't know if you've come across the Belgian Rambo, who has disappeared with like RPG and various other weapons, who's apparently the anti-lockdown Rambo, who apparently was what was he doing? The guy who's like the head scientist who is behind Belgium's sort of global house arrest policy in response to coronavirus. So he's been stalked by him. Now, if you have more people with sort of what they perceive as loyalty to a particular group identity, which is separate to the state, then of course they're going to need to be removed. Something that this is I'm reading from a picture that was taken from a British Army guide to look out for. This guy was handed out to high-ranking British military officials to look out for extreme right-wing men in the military. Things such as describe themselves as patriots, refer to political correctness as some left-wing or communist plot, make inaccurate generalizations about the left or government, involve colleagues in closed social media groups, become increasingly angry at perceived injustices or threats to so-called national identity. I mean, this is just, and this is right at the top of the military, and you'll see exactly the same thing as is happening in the US as you here. Also, when it comes to Keith was saying with respect to the police, that the sort of the SJWizing of the police is already taking place in England to a significant extent. I think there was calls to make it so that any policeman had to have a degree. And it's like, if that's not sort of like making sure you pass the ideological test to begin with, I don't know what is, because what they're moving away from is, again, same with the military, the sort of white working class being the main individuals who end up in the police and the military. But of course, those are the ones who are the most ethnocentric these days, and in a sense disloyal to the system, so cannot therefore be employed. An interesting point you made in respect to the American military, with respect to desegregation, etc. I always thought it was interesting that there was always a lot of airtime given to the Gurkhas. Now, I'm not sure if you're aware of who the Gurkhas are, but the Gurkhas are the name given to the Indian people who were part of sort of the British Army, effectively, and they were particularly known for their work, their role in the Second World War. And it's always been like, oh no, this Gurkha soldier, he's going to get deported because he's failed some weird arcane immigration rule. And then everyone mobilizes in support of the Gurkhas, which, in individual case may be perfectly reasonable. But I do think if it had been some other foreign but white British Army one, I don't know, maybe it was an Australian citizen somewhere was going to get deported who'd fought for the British at some point. I don't think it'd be used in the same way. So the same tendencies that you're seeing in the American military are increasingly becoming mainstream in the UK. As a classic sort of tabloid article with this. Apparently, the MOD in England is looking for this was back in, when was this? This was back in 2020 in September. They were looking for a diversity inclusion director who would be paid £110,000 a year, which apparently is more than an army colonel. So we can see where the the priorities lie in the current British military. So yeah, the similar trends that happening in America are happening here. To what extent we're copying you, I'm not sure, or whether they're all happening at the same time. Although I tend to think we copy what you do eventually, and so I think that's probably to a large extent what's happening.
Well, Swithun, I think everybody's copying you Brits. I mean, you invented the technocratic society. You can read George Orwell and H.G. Wells and all these other guys that were talking about it. So, but I think the interesting intersection here between the idea of military service veterans and the current crop of identity politics is I think there are at least two reasons why they're doing this now. One is these people that are, really divided from each other. Oh, and ultimately what they want all identities to be is an identity group of one, where each individual is so, autistically defined that he's an identity group of one. And when everybody's an identity group of one, then there's no solidarity and they can't work with each other. They can't talk to each other. Which is great, right? Because then the establishment can then use all these people and put them into their machine. So I think that's one reason why the Army's doing this. And I think the other reason is obviously a lot of people, joke around about these groups. First, the homosexuals, and now certainly trannies and pregnant women in the armed forces. How is America going to win a war? Well, I mean, those people aren't going to be the ones fighting. What they're really going to be is they're going to be the commissars, because they're ideologically loyal, because they know that the system is what makes their life possible and successful. And if it were to go away, they would have a much more difficult life. They're going to end up being commissars. And I think that's really the issue here. And some evidence that it's already happened is that Matthew Bracken, who's a retired Navy SEAL, he was interviewed. I saw an interview of he was in. It was about a 2-year-old interview. I saw it like a few months ago, and he was saying that he knows guys that are still in the Army, but nobody will say anything if there's a woman in the room, even a female private, because she'll just go complain to human resources or management, and they'll always take her side. And so basically, she's effectively silenced all dissent just by being there, which creates in a wartime situation the danger of groupthink, because nobody's going to tell the officer, or the higher ups that this is stupid because they don't want to get reported. Now, of course, this is just as far as I know, heterosexual woman, not any of these other identity groups. But you can see though that it's going to be something like that, where they'll be used as a sort of internal policing force, sort of like I said, commissars. What are some of your thoughts on that, Keith?
Yeah, well, I was actually discussing that recently with a guy who was in the military, and he was telling me that in the service today, like in his words, he said much of what you do in the military is a de facto welfare program or a public works, make work program, or an affirmative action program. And the thing is, as far as all the heavy lifting, that is the actual combat and that kind of stuff, most of that increasingly is done either by the special forces, or it's done by foreign proxy armies, or it's done by these mercenary organizations like Blackwater Academy. So it's sort of like they're building an army that just sort of has no real military purpose other than things like logistics and that kind of stuff. Instead, they're outsourcing much of the actual fighting, the traditional function of militaries, to other places, to foreign countries, foreign armies, mercenaries, private contractors, and then they're maintaining an elite special forces unit, for when they have to have actual troops who can fight. And as far as the idea that people in the military are going to be the commissars, I think that is something that is spreading throughout institutions generally. I think we see this in all institutions. What we're starting to see is this professional managerial class, as it's sometimes called by social scientists. And these are people who tend to be educated people that, in the sense of holding degrees, and they tend to be from outside the traditional elite. They're not necessarily from the most affluent or wealthy families, so they represent something of a rising force in society. It's really a lot of this that's sort of become the base of the Democratic Party nowadays. It's this kind of urbanized, suburbanized, college educated, professional managerial class. In fact, some research I've seen shows that the principal dividing line in American politics when it comes to voting is actually education. That somebody who has a college degree or higher is much, much more likely to be a Democrat than virtually any other category relative to people who do not have college degrees. And I've seen that among students. I've had students that I've taught who were in the military, and they were undergraduate level students, and they seem to be going for this as well. They have, like, they're pursuing a degree in this or that because that's going to advance their military career. Now, I've also had discussions with people in the military about political correctness, wokeness, all this kind of stuff in the military. And male members of the military will complain about how they talk about sexual harassment incessantly. And they have all of these things you have to go to now, these training sessions that are about, sensitivity and cultural competence and all of this kind of stuff. So it's the same thing that you see happening in corporations now, in human resources departments. It's also going on, and of course, in public sector agencies, and as we know, in education and all of that kind of stuff. So the military, which has often been thought of as a more conservative institution, is really being integrated with this wider paradigm that we see emerging, where the legitimacy of the state is derived from this kind of woke ideology. And we have our society is good because we're a democracy, and the way we're a democracy is that we're inclusive of everyone, and we're multicultural, we're gay friendly, we're feminized, all these kinds of things. I think there's a great deal of effort being made to include the military in that category as well.
Yeah, Swithun, what are your thoughts?
I think Keith's right about the rise of the sort of professional managerial class. In a way, it isn't surprising that what they have sort of done in corporations is now going to the military. The corporation as such is now I'm going to sound sort of like a reactionary. In a way, is a rather artificial organization which kind of treats everybody as blank slate and individuals with no ties to anything or anybody. They are just basically a form of human capital, which can be molded, can be moved, and can be put to wherever it is best utilized. And consequently, their idea is, well, we need to treat everybody equally. There's no real essential differences on a group level between everybody. It's this sort of, in a sense, radical individual and also radical egalitarian approach. But then at the same time is utilized in such a way to manifest white guilt and sort of like a white savior complex. And this is, for some reason, I think this comes from the large corporation as sort of a way of managing people, but it's certainly been consistent with the sort of leftist culturist ideology, which has sort of grown up post 45. Now, what causes what's another question, but they're certainly complementary. So it's not surprising that these people do it in corporations, and they also do it in the military for a similar reason. And I think you're right, Todd. One of the reasons so put it this way, the ideal corporate employee is single, has no family ties, and will go and do whatever the corporation wants at any part of the country at any time, and owes his entire existence to the corporation. That's what the corporation wants, and I think this is what the military is effectively trying to do. At the same time, it's no longer a local militia with ties to the area defending their people, their place, their land. It's a way of being able to deploy them anywhere and anywhere, and the loyalty is solely to the governing elite. In a way, although my history is not as good as others on here, in a way, this seems similar to what the Roman Empire did towards the end, getting all these other groups in to fight as soldiers because it couldn't raise enough of its traditional Roman block stream of people is what I mean. And so, yeah, it does seem similar in that respect. But again, it isn't, as I say, it is not surprising that the managerial class do have this type of approach. And it's sort of similar as well to the education system, because for all their free thinking that they allege to promote, really, the university system these days is just an upper class it's kind of an upper class factory job as well. Whilst you don't graduate from a factory as such, I suppose you could argue graduate if you become a manager. In the same way, you graduate university by doing what they tell you and regurgitating what they want you to know, and at which point you're given a nice prize of a graduate, of being labeled a graduate now because you now have your degree. And it's just sort of like a big sort of cookie cutter sort of homogenizing kind of process, which in a sense is very akin to the factory system, which most of those professors would claim that they despise.
Yeah. One thing that's you brought up the corporate structure and its needs. And I think that's also why identity politics has grown up and taken the shape it has, because one of the things that's so important about identity politics is being flamboyant and showing that you are a part of an identity by what you wear and what you own. And so the corporate system can cater to all of these groups, selling them stuff that they can then use to show how extra special they are, and then throw it away when they're done, and rinse and repeat. And so it's like a built-in constituency or a built-in consumer base. And of course, these people are deluded enough to think that they're doing this on their own, when these identities were really all created by the corporate structure to fit them in so that they could be these good little consumers. But that's really sort of the last thing I have. And I think it's about time to have closing statements. So we'll start with you, Keith.
Well, what I think is interesting to look at is the possibilities in terms of where this is going to go in the future. I'm always interested in tracing how institutions evolve over time and trying to determine what kind of direction that institutions are headed in. And military culture in the United States, I think, is, like as I've been saying, is taking on a new form and a new direction. And I'm wondering if whether that's going to have the effect of actually eroding some of this more traditional military identity politics or whatever. For instance, a lot of people who are socially conservative or culturally conservative or politically conservative tend to have a high, favorable, certainly a very favorable view of the military. But if the military comes to be viewed as a liberal institution, that would certainly change. Certainly the conservative side of the spectrum greatly dislikes the university system. They greatly dislike the media because they see those as institutions that are bastions of the what they consider to be the enemy. The further institutions like the military go in that kind of direction, I think the cultural right is going to feel increasingly alienated from the military. At the same time, I think the left will ironically start to increasingly embrace the military. In fact, we've already seen that during the Trump era, because the FBI and the CIA and institutions like that were opposed to Trump. All of a sudden, those become heroic institutions to the liberal side of the political spectrum. I'm increasingly seeing research where people who could think of themselves as Democrats, for example, have an increasingly favorable view of institutions like the FBI. It used to be, say, back in the 1970s, you had the Church Committee in Congress that was investigating all of these shady things the intelligence services have been doing, like COINTELPRO and all of that. And that was fairly the norm until fairly recently. Until very recently, liberals tended to have a fairly suspicious view of certain of law enforcement, of the FBI, of intelligence, of the military, and now that's starting to change. Now we're starting to see liberals taking a more favorable view of these things, in part, I think, because those institutions are now using this kind of rainbow ideology as a means of legitimation. That I think is going to be a really interesting cultural shift where liberals are now the ones who worship the troops, and liberals are now the ones who worship the federal law enforcement, or who worship the intelligence services. I saw a prelude to this in the '90s when Waco was going on and when the militia movement was going on. I saw commentary by liberals and others further to the left saying, isn't it great that the ATF put down these fascist insurrectionaries at Waco or something like that? And increasingly, I think we're going to see more and more of that. We're going to see more and more law and order liberalism and more patriotic liberalism, and although it'll be this kind of rainbow patriotism, it won't be the traditional American civil religion, and we'll see liberals having a fonder view of the military, while people with more conservative values will start to have an increasingly negative view of these things.
Yeah, Swithun, final thoughts.
I think that's definitely going to happen, and I think, whilst not an identity politics issue per se, I do think lockdown enforcement will accelerate this. It's obvious that the traditional sort of red Republican is the one who is most skeptical of the responses to coronavirus with lockdowns, etc., etc. And I do think that this episode, as it's still going on, will further radicalize the right against the police and of the military by extension to some extent. And whilst on the other hand, they will be seen by the left and the liberals as enforcers of public health. This is why we need the police, to make people healthy, and everyone will get along nice. We can't stop. We have to stop these bioweapons that exist. These people, we must keep them locked in their houses. And so I think you're going to get an obvious sort of authoritarian Democrat, or is it a right-wing Democrat, authoritarian Democrat type approach when it comes to the military. So for example, in England, back onto the identity politics things, there's loads of videos of the police coming out and engaging in gay pride parades, and they took, there was lots of vigils when they took the knee alongside Black Lives Matter protesters back in, was it May of last year. It's when the counter protests come out a week later, then it's beat them up, as is to be expected. So you do think you will continually see a decrease in the respect for police and the military and amongst its traditional supporters.
All right. Thank you, Keith Preston and Swithun Dobson. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.